parsha that we're going to be discussing is Truma. I want to basically cover two subjects. One subject is the construction of the tabernacle, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how Nachmanides, Ramban, speaks about the construction of the tabernacle. And then the second subject is going to be the question of gifts, just in general. And this is a sort of perpetual issue in human life, as you know, and we're going to talk about it a little bit in the biblical, but also sort of in the general sense of what it means to give a gift and what a gift is. But let's start with the tabernacle itself. Nachmanides, Ramban, in his introduction to the Parsha, points out that there are a lot of parallels between Sinai and the tabernacle. So, for example, it says that God, Shachan, would dwell at Sinai, and this is the Mishkan, from the same root of dwelling. The phrase, the presence of God filled the tabernacle, appears twice, which matches the presence of his greatness in Deuteronomy 5:21, talking about God at the mountain of Sinai. And there are several others. I don't need to go through all of them. You can probably find an English translation of Nachmanides' introduction to the Parsha if you're interested. But the idea is that the tabernacle is a kind of traveling Sinai, in the sense that the tabernacle is where God's presence is revealed to the Jewish people over and over and over and over again. That is, God comes down on the mountain, and by coming down on the mountain, coming down, speaking now, not literally, because it's not like God walks down the mountain, but by presenting God's self at the mountain, God first establishes this relationship with the people, this intimacy with the people, and the tabernacle allows that relationship and intimacy to continue on and on and on throughout the time that they wander in the desert. And then obviously when they come into the land, the building of the temple is the natural extension of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, which is a sort of traveling temple. So you can see how the symbolic continuity is set up. Sinai, Mishkan, temple. And if you absorb that, you can understand also very clearly how shattering it was, even in a symbolic sense, that the temple could be destroyed. I'm talking about the destruction of the first temple in 586, which is where we get the book of Echa, the time of Jeremiah. That idea was that you were, in a sense, destroying the Jewish people's intimacy and relationship, or the mechanism of their intimacy and relationship with God, beginning at Sinai and traveling through the desert. And Truma talks about the building of the Mishkan and the way in which the Mishkan also reflects in certain verses and tropes God's creation of the world. So there is this sort of sweeping continuity from creation through Sinai, through tabernacle, through temple, that is represented by, not represented by, but is rather the vehicle for God's continuous presence through the world and through history. And that's part of what Truma is about, which enables it to be, even though it's not as exciting in some ways as the stories, it's at least as important. And it begins with a phrase that I want to, as they say, interrogate more carefully. It's Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. God says to Moses, Daber el bnei Israel, speak to the Israelites, V'yikhu li truma, and take for me a contribution. Me'et kol ish, from every person. It's literally man, but ish can be man or person. Asher yidvenu libo, whose heart volunteers it, I guess is the best way to put it. The translation here is every person whose heart so moves him. The same thing, tikhu et trumati, take my contribution. So in other words, this is not tzedakah, because tzedakah, strictly speaking, is a kind of tax in the Jewish tradition. Even though tzedakah is designed for the poor, it is a mandatory contribution. Tzedakah comes from the root tzedek, righteousness. It's not chesed. It's not charity. It's not, if your heart moves you, you should give tzedakah. According to Jewish law, you are supposed to give tzedakah, whether your heart moves you or not, because that's an obligation for all Jews to contribute. But here you're talking about a gift, and truma is wrapped up in the concept of gifts. So what is a gift? This is one of those ideas that we all know, but the more we think about it, the more tricky it becomes. Because very often we give gifts with the intention of getting something back, even if it's only a thank you note. I remember how my mother was insistent. We sat down right after my bar mitzvah and started writing, and she would hand me the stationery, and I had to write all the thank you notes, because if someone gives you a gift, you send them a note. But of course, if it's a gift, the question is, are they owed something back? I am certainly a fan of the thank you note, and I try my best to write thank you notes when appropriate. But the question is, what is a gift? So there was a famous sociological study of this. So it's not exactly sociological, philosophical, written in the early 80s, called The Gift by Lewis Hyde. And this is what he says. Once the imagination has been awakened, it is procreative. Through it, we give more than we were given, say more than we had to say. And his idea of the gift is, when you receive a gift, a true gift, it is a gift that in the cliche that we use, keeps on giving, but what that really means is the gift allows you to do or give in ways you couldn't before. That is, the gift circulates according to the sort of gift economy. It gets passed on. It's the opposite of a commodity. A commodity, you give me, I consume, or you give me and I give you. But a gift creates its own atmosphere. So it can be that I consume it. Let's say you give me a bottle of wine, but I consume it, and because it's a gift, it changes my disposition towards the world and my willingness to do something similar for someone else. In other words, a gift, for Hyde, at least in his definition, creates a chain of giving. That's a true gift, because people feel the spirit in which you give it. If you give a gift with the idea of being given something back, that's not exactly the same. The gift circulates according to the gift economy, in which relations are largely personal and conducted with the aim of profiting the other, right? If you give a gift, the purpose is to enhance the well-being or something else of the other person. In the market economy, value accrues by hoarding or saving. In the gift economy, value accrues by giving and receiving. So you understand the difference here, right? It's not about what you get and keep and hoard, which is a kind of negative way of saying keeping it. It is about this circulation of voluntary giving that makes you feel different in the giving, and also makes the recipient see the world differently in the receiving. And this idea fits very nicely. The reason I bring it up is it fits very nicely into Truma. One of the interesting things about Truma is, unlike, say, a modern synagogue or whatever, nobody knows what was contributed to what, right? When you build the tabernacle, you don't have a little plaque that says this section of the tabernacle was contributed by the Wolpe family. Instead, it all gets melded into one whole, but as the tabernacle moves through the wilderness, Israel around it moves knowing what I have and gave contributed to the creation of this tabernacle. And therefore, its function as a part of Israel's devotion to God and God's presence among the Israelites is in part due to my contribution. And therefore, it defines itself according to this gift economy of continually both giving and receiving something that is valuable and important. The way that the Torah puts it, the way that God puts it, is somebody whose heart moves them to give. And this is also important from a particular emotional story, situational point of view, in the sense that, remember what happened with the Israelites. They came out, they come to Sinai. We haven't actually reached the golden calf, but it's not clear in terms of the timing, whether it's before or after. But they're having a hard time. It's not like this has been a smooth transition. They complained, which point got about the manna, and throughout their time in the desert, even though later Jeremiah speaks about it as ahavat no'orayach, the love of the youth of the time when they went through the wilderness together, God and the people, as with a lot of nostalgia, when you actually look at what happened, not such smooth sailing. I guess you don't sail through a desert. It's like, that's too mixed a metaphor. Not very smooth sand walking in the deserts. In fact, the Israelites are angry and bitter and resentful, and talk about, why don't we go back to Egypt? And all of this in what are obviously harsh conditions. And therefore, for God to put it this way is very deliberate. The one whose heart moves him, the one who, despite all the difficulties and the blocks that are attendant on Israel's entry into the desert and wandering in the desert, still has enough love in their heart to want to give, not only to God, but also to the community, because obviously the tabernacle is part of the community's institutions by which it continues to worship God. I am tempted to draw some parallels with giving to a synagogue. The same thing around every synagogue. There swirls difficulties and angers and resentments and problems and also devotion and love. And some people's hearts move them to give to the synagogue, and others not. And certainly Truma, the tabernacle, is the sort of example of the synagogue in the desert, and even the idea of the artistry of it, that it's created by Bezalel, who is an artist and an artisan, is similar to the modern way in which we fashion our worship spaces. While it is true that you can pray anywhere and that synagogues need not be beautiful or even pretty or even nice, when it is possible to do so, Jews have traditionally tried to make synagogues as aesthetically appealing as possible. So you have this notion of truma, and the first part of it is just what the nature of the gift is, that it is a self-perpetuating giving and receiving, a movement of the heart, something that is very different from a sale or an exchange or a commodity. And related to this idea is the recognition that human beings are capable of giving to God. This is part of the idea behind sacrifice as well, because it is understandable if you have a Greek pagan god who's very human-like, who gets upset and fights and gets angry, that you can give them things. And in fact, the sacrifices were, in most pagan mythologies, literally consumed by the god who wanted them. But once you have a god who is not a pagan god, who is not a person, who doesn't eat and doesn't drink, and is intangible and is unimaginable, literally unimaginable. You cannot imagine God, much less feed God or give God something to drink. Hydrate, I guess, is the opposite, is the complement to feed God, or hydrate God, as though God runs marathons. But once you have that, how do you give to God? What is it that you're supposed to do for God? Because every relationship has to have some element of reciprocity, or it's not a relationship. And one answer that Judaism gives, which you know, is the way in which we treat each other, because we're all God's children, and therefore when I treat you well, I am, as it were, giving a gift to God by my kindness towards God's children. But the other part of this is that you can actually literally give to God by building the Mishkan and doing in the Mishkan what God wants done, by building the tabernacle and eventually by sacrifices in the tabernacle, not because God needs them, but because this is a way that human beings feel that they can contribute to God, and also, of course, maintain, since most of the sacrifices were consumed by the priests, maintain the apparatus of God's temple and God's tabernacle. So the way in which Truma fits into sort of the psyche of the worshiper is really important. It is, in a way, the payback. I have gotten you out of Egypt, now build me this Mishkan. But again, of course, we understand all of this is not because of God's need, but because of human need. And yet it also allows humans to fulfill the need of being able to give God. And in that sense, Truma plays a central psychological role, the role of being able to be a giver. And that, as we know religiously, is extraordinarily powerful in people's psyche. No, I'm not. I can't keep a map of where people are visiting from, Jason. I see that there are people from all over, but I'm busy teaching, so I actually can't keep that record. If anyone else wants to keep that record, that'd be quite wonderful. Also, I don't see the YouTube comments and don't know where people are visiting from on YouTube, because I actually can't monitor everybody while I teach at the same time. Anyone who wants to look on both YouTube and Facebook and see where people are writing in from, God bless you. That would be a gift, speaking of gifts. So the idea here of human beings being able to give to God tells you something about the way in which giving interacts with our own psyche. Because I have found many times that the most effective therapeutic, for example, for somebody who is depressed or upset or whatever, is to have them give. That sometimes our over self-involvement is bad for our own psychological health, and to come out of yourself is the path to salvation. And the way you come out of yourself is by forcing yourself to give to others. And it's very hard to be depressed when you're working at a soup kitchen, because your focus for the moment is taken away from your own problems and directed towards the other. And so you can see all of Truma, in a sense, as God's, this is to reduce it far too much, but I hope if you followed me this far, you'll understand what I'm saying, as God's therapy for the Israelites. They're grumpy, they're angry, they're this, they're that. And God says, you know what you need? You need to give. You need to give. That will make you better. And I think that's, that is continued. The question of how does Truma match with Korban, with sacrifices, that's continued with the sacrifices, because once the tabernacle is built, it's built. So how do you continue to give? The way you continue to give to God is through the Korbanot, through the sacrifices. And of course, those of you who are familiar with the Hebrew know that Korban, the Hebrew word for Korban, comes from karov, which means close. A Korban is to draw close. And certainly, as in Hyde's definition that I talked about before, the practice of giving is a practice of drawing close. People that you give to, you feel closer to. This is a strange phenomenon. You think sometimes that people that you receive from, you feel closer to. But it is also very much the case that people that you give to, you feel closer to. And the idea behind Korban is a sort of constant one, that causes that you give to, you feel closer to, individuals that you give to, you feel closer to. And this tells you that the Jewish idea of training a religious personality is not solely an action-oriented or a deed-oriented idea. That in fact, as Bachya put it, chovot halavavot, the obligations of the heart, but I would say even more, the conditioning of the heart, the training of the heart, is central to being a religious personality. How you feel is obviously intimately intertwined with the way you act. And while sometimes the action moves inward, like as I said, if you're working at a soup kitchen, it's very hard to be depressed because the action affects the way you feel internally. The opposite is also true, that certain hearts are disposed to certain actions. And that's why it's so beautiful that God says anyone whose heart moves them to give, because it is not solely a function of God says, I have to have a tabernacle, so, pay up. Rather, God says, if you are moved to, and we know that the Israelites were so moved that Moshe in the end had to say, that's enough. I don't need more, which is, of course, every fundraiser's dream. I think it's only happened once in history, but it's every fundraiser's dream, which is to say, no, you don't have to give me any more. You've given me more than enough. And because of it, you see that there is, even in the complaining, whining, upset Israelites, there is this heart of goodness and giving that I would say endures to this day. I think that Jews tend to be extremely charitable people in all sorts of ways. And it's partly the training of the tradition. And I think also it's just partly goodness of heart, which is, by the way, again, is not to say that other people are not. If I say, for example, that I don't know, that I read a lot of books, I'm not saying other people don't read books. And here too, that charitableness is a beautiful human trait. And I think many of the Jews I know exemplify it. And it is clearly pointed to right here at the beginning of Jewish history in Truma, where we learn that giving is a central part of what it means to be a person. And you cannot, and that ultimately selfishness is self-defeating, because people who are selfish tend not to be happy. And yet I've rarely met, maybe never met, somebody who was essentially a giving person that was also a miserable person. So there is wisdom in these words, unsurprisingly. And with that, barring any questions, and I don't see any at the moment, how would you compare Truma with Korban? Okay, I spoke about that. Clinton, yep, agrees, and he knows Clinton is somebody who has volunteered an awful lot of his time, and understands that this giving of your time, of your care, of your concern, it does help you and change you. And by the way, just to end, okay, I'll address Shirley Ann's question, and I was going to end by saying, like, this teaching, which I might be considered a giving, but also fills me up to be able to do it. Shirley Ann says, what about somebody who gives and gives and gives, and the other person just takes and takes and takes? Well, that's obviously an unhealthy dynamic, and I'm not speaking specifically about that. And there are times when you have to say, I've given as much as I can give, or as much as I will give, and that's it. But in the normal course of dynamics, this is how it works. And every statement about human nature can always be taken to an extreme that it's unhealthy. There are people who can give to the point where it becomes compulsive, and people who take to the point where it is not a question of receiving, but of selfishness. But barring that, to twist the words of Michael Douglas in that movie where he says, greed is good, I'm going to end with these words: giving is good. So thank you for giving of your time to Torah.